Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Wilson, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here to this discussion around our second shorts program. Before we get started, I'll just take a moment to introduce everyone here. We have, starting out the program, Akosua Adoma Owusu, Director of King of Sanwi, Simon Liu and Jennie MaryTai Liu, Directors of Force, Sunil Sansgiri, Director of Letter from Your Far Off Country, Shobhan Bailey, Director of Trust Study Number 1. And last but not least, Ricardo Giaconi, Director of Ekphrasis. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, it's rare to have every film represented in a shorts Q&A, so thank you all for joining for this. I'll touch on your films individually at first and probably go in the order that they screened, but I hope you'll all feel free to jump in at any point with thoughts or questions to each other. In fact, I think that would be really great. But for the time being, I'll start the conversation off with Adoma. I'm wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about your initial interest in these two particular records we see of Michael Jackson in Africa.
Yes.
He's a figure who's played a part in your work before, so maybe as a follow-up question to that, I'm curious to hear how he as a figure or an icon has sort of fit in your recent interests as a filmmaker.
Absolutely. Well, first I would like to thank Film at Lincoln Center for celebrating my work this year. And last year it's been quite an honor to be the recipient of the 2020 Lincoln Center Award for Emerging Artists, and to be in this program, Free Radicals, in reference to Len Lai, who is a great source of inspiration for my work. It's kind of interesting because, with Michael Jackson, in this present time and space, you think about him as a global icon and how he was able to sort of transcend race relations and creative relations in terms of like music and dance and all creative forms. And somehow, I don't know, just with this pandemic, I just sort of felt like this kind of out-of-body experience to sort of take this avant-garde medium or experimental form that I've sort of inherited, right? And to sort of activate this figure who went through trauma, and as a Black man in this time and space, I was thinking about Black bodies and how we can sort of sort of render this his affinity with the continent of Africa. He traveled, even though he faced a lot of backlash in the West, he's celebrated in other parts of the world, whether it's Brazil or the Ivory Coast, where he was crowned king. And the title King of Sanwi is based on that, the fact that he is celebrated on the continent of Africa. And I'm sort of looking to indigenous cultures and sort of going back to the origins, kind of taking from my past and bringing that into the present in this form that I've inherited. And just sort of using Michael Jackson as subject matter to sort of for cultural production, especially in this time and space.
Yeah, as you're saying, thematically, your films have often been about complicating issues of identity and race, and
absolutely.
And you do so here, like by reworking pre-existing footage. You're placing these materials and in effect these two different time periods on top of each other in really interesting ways. And so I'm wondering, I guess, as a follow-up, could you talk about the creative role archival material plays in your work as a tool of your filmmaking?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm trained as a cinematographer. I shoot a lot on Super 8 and 16mm film, and I was sort of thinking about how to make work when I'm in isolation, right? And the best thing to do was to sort of work with this archive. And what the interesting thing with the piece that the film is based It really was from the only existing archive of or documentation of the Jackson Five traveling to Senegal on their first African tour when Michael Jackson was a kid. This was an unfinished documentary that was basically, I found it on a, like this House of Nubian, like this sort of place that sells like Pan-African material or whatever. And I was so excited to get access to it. And I found that it was like this knockoff version, you know, it wasn't like the original. So I was like, oh, well, what can I do with this pre-existing, you know, this material, even though it's not like the best quality. I was thinking about, you know, Ghana and Nigerians film and how, you know, we work straight to video, and in our culture, it's kind of about, you know, theatrical experience is basically going straight theater on film, or, you know, and when I found this footage, I thought, how can I connect to my culture being so far away, or to even engage audiences globally the way Michael Jackson did in this, you know, in a short period of time. And when I got this footage, I really wanted to think about this man-child persona that he sort of used. You know, he's a shapeshifter, and I think we can do that in experimental film, right? We're as filmmakers and creators, we're shapeshifters, and we're able to like bring elements together through sound and image. And the more we layer and layer, you know, these ideas, new ideas start to emerge. And I just thought about how he had this man-child persona that he sort of used as a strategy, and it sort of kind of crippled or failed. And what happened when he sort of it's like he's almost like a yin and a yang, you know, he's like both. He's like labeled as bad, but then he's also cherished, you know, by indigenous cultures or people all over the world. So what do you know, how do you insert that or create this kind of, bring this information to light in this short period of time? And I don't know, I sort of just started thinking about that in my studio. How do I bring this, you know, create this Pan-African sort of experience that can relate to these political issues of our time, present day, or what's happening right now in our culture.
Yeah, you really bring out I think the multi-layered nature and sort of the non-linear connections between these two periods, these two people, in really interesting ways. Simon and Jennie, I'll turn to you because I think there's a similar layering effect happening in your film. I think in a more tense way. The way the animation plays against the footage and the voiceover, and I do want to talk about how that emerged in your collaboration together. But could you start off by giving us some background as to when you shot this footage and in what parts of Hong Kong you were filming in for this film?
We began this process a year ago, so July of last year, which was right at the beginning of the wave of year-long protests that would transpire. I brought my family to visit our dad that lives there, and Simon was there at the same time. And so we were able to experience together the unfolding of the crisis IRL on the street and through our phones, through our screens. And it became imperative to us that we needed to process and come to a deeper understanding of what was happening through working together. So that was when. In terms of where, we shot a lot on the outlying islands of Hong Kong, actually. A lot of the footage was in one particular island called Cheung Chau, which is one of the hundreds of very small inhabited fishing villages. But but some of the footage was also footage that Simon had in his studio. You want to say anything about where specifically, Si?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess we're talking about this idea of like very placid images, these very serene kind of representations of a place, and how that might contradict some kind of like underlying current of what was happening. And so, yeah, a lot of those images were kind of taken in Chungcheong. And I don't know if you knew this, Jen, but actually like recently they released this kind of document saying that a lot of the training for the protesters actually took place on that same island. Yeah, it's crazy, right? And so yeah, this idea of like these very like these spaces that have like a feeling that's inviting, almost just like kind of like almost like a touristic kind of element to it, and what that means in terms of Hong Kong as being like a global city where people are invited to come and do business and to live, and like what does that mean in contrast with all these kind of unfolding events, you know? But Jennie, as you were, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we, you know, it being like any socio-political crisis, intensely multivalenced, full of, you know, multitudes of subjectivities and dense layers of history, we just needed to find an entryway. And so we sort of followed our interest in the ways in which the various bodies and forces at play in the conflict were messaging and communicating using visual language and verbal, textual, written language. And so we started to closely follow the daily kind of accountability statements that the Hong Kong police were putting out, and started to cull pertinent phrases, interesting bits of text from press statements and social media and the website, which would eventually become our script. But yeah, I mean, what was really compelling right from the offset was how effective the protest movement was right from the beginning on bringing the police to their knees, and you know, in their ability to grind the civic infrastructure of the city to a halt and keep it there for months. And so, at least initially, the police were really displaying or presenting as victim in a way, right? As
self-presenting as victim.
Self-presenting as victim, right? So that there was a kind of, you know, the force is beleaguered, right? There was at least a neutrality to their tone, and a resistance at first in their strategy, like to talk about it in maybe like stereotypical gender terms. That there was like almost a kind of like receptive, passive femininity to their quality that, yeah, like they were like the yin in a way to the protesters, like offensive, aggressive, by necessity yang, you know? And so that, like, we kind of ran with that like counterintuitive kind of presentation and gathered images that had a kind of like diminutive quality to them. So like inanimate objects, like plants and animals, and the use of the color pink a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I detected like a particular interest in like an aquatic life, and I'm wondering if that's something that just came about from being on that island. But it also seems like you're filming a lot in an amusement park as well.
There's
Ocean Park. It's every kid in Hong Kong growing up knows that place. And I think like we went there all together with Jennie's child and our mom. And I think just like thinking about like that place that had so much like of a sentiment growing up, and like what that meant going there at the time when everything was unfolding. This kind of contradiction of like these very warm and inviting memories in conflict with like looking on the news and seeing what was going on constantly. And one of the crazy things about the Hong Kong protests, it's known as being like the most live streamed protest. So the revolution was like live streamed in a very direct manner. You know, you would go on any like broadcast news channel in Hong Kong, and like there would be like multiple angles going on concurrently. And so there was like this idea of like everything was shown, like accessibility of those images was very prevalent. And so the fact that we're kind of working with these like objective, so-called objective statements by the police, and also these very kind of accusations and these things put forward by the protesters in the movement, saying completely different things and very contradicting values. However, there's still this very like somewhat objective document of these things that took place on a daily basis. So I think also we were very interested in this idea of this dissonance and this kind of like malleability of truth. And as well, so after that summer, we went back to our respective homes in New York and Los Angeles, and kind of like continued to watch the protests and everything happening kind of heighten to higher and higher peaks. We would often look at this information through like Instagram, Twitter, all these different social media platforms. And there was this massive disjuncture between the way that these images and events were presented, often in like very meme, like kind of millennial design formats. And so to see kind of these very like often traumatic or intense scenes, but for them to be depicted through this like blanket of like softness, it was like also goes back to kind of what we were speaking about before as well. Yeah.
But sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to touch on the animation specifically as a response to this sort of dissonant response that you were seeing as the protests were unfolding. Did you work on these together?
Sorry, my sound cut out while you asked the question, Tyler. I'm sorry.
It was a question of just how you constructed the animations, if you worked together or separately on that.
Simon, you really took the lead on the animation.
Yeah, I really nerded out with that one. Well, we kind of built up the script, and then we edited together all of like the more traditional film material. And we knew we wanted the film to kind of have this like interface, almost like a digital interface kind of platform to it, in the way that like these opposing forces would be shown. And so basically I took like PNG documents of a lot of, like there's like the district council logo for all these different regions. There's like the health authority in there. And so I basically took those PNGs and like animated them in After Effects, and then like composited them together to kind of like give life to these like to these government logos. And so there's kind of this like the conflict is like kind of taking place between these logos and these starfish. There were actually like dried starfish that are made to eat. And so those are also animated as well. So it's like this idea of creating creating like an anthropomorphic identification of these images. And so that kind of goes along as well with this idea of like these placid, tranquil scenes, but like what is represented by them is like there's a dissonance between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, finally, in terms of the starfish, and you asked about the aquatic imagery, you know, I think we're really interested in the organizational structure of the protest movement, which seems to be like in the lineage of Occupy without a central leadership and, you know, functioning through social media. And so the metaphor, I guess, of the invertebrate seemed really appropriate as a highly intelligent, effective creature that operates without a central nervous system.
Sunil, I'll turn to you as I understand it, this film, Letter from Your Far Off Country, is the second in a series of films that you started with your father, the first being At Home But Not at Home. You use that relationship, at least it seems in this film, as a jumping off point. But I'm curious if you can tell us a bit how this particular film started for you, and maybe how it fits into this larger, if ongoing, project.
Yeah, so thank you again for having me here. I'm really excited. I love this program. I love everyone's work. It's an honor to be showing with you all.
Love your film too.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, your film is amazing, Sunil.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is the kind of second in a line of hopefully longer works. There might, you know, I'm planning on a third, but it follows off of, almost immediately kind of picks up off the last one, which was interviews with my father about living under Portuguese colonialism, growing up there. He was 18 when our home state of Goa was liberated, and that was, you know, 13 years after India gained independence. So this kind of like twofold layer of colonialism going on, but then also looking to like what else was happening in the world at that time, which is, it's kind of, the last film touched on the Bandung conference that happened in Indonesia in 1955, this kind of cross-continental solidarity amongst all colonized people in the world. And it goes on to kind of like look at liberation movements that were nascent liberation movements that were happening in Africa and the Portuguese occupied territories of Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau. And so, yeah, that kind of informed a lot of the, the way I wanted to approach this work in terms of cross-continental solidarity, but it's also, this line of work really is looking at ancestral memory too, identity and ancestral memory, how memories passed down through generations, through myth making, really. And so in the points at which I actually start talking with my father, interviews with him, he's talking about the migration of our family from Bengal and from these mountains, these really mythic mountains. That's how the film begins. And the kind of mythology of our last name, meaning those who come from this one specific mountain. And so it's a departure because it's also looking at what's going on right now in India. Sorry, my email just went off. Simon and Jennie were talking about this kind of like Occupy, this like kind of like the way in which like the Occupy movement that started in 2011 migrated to different areas around the world, and the spirit of Occupy kind of that decentralized movement still lives on in many places. Many uprisings, many ruptures, many insurrections that we see. In one such insurrection and you know, deoccupation would be the Shaheen Bagh, was now called the Shaheen Bagh movement in India, which started predominantly through Muslim women who, you know, this is in response to the CAA and NPR and NRC bills that basically prevent Muslims from becoming citizens in India. And this is a long history going back to not only partition and colonialism, of pitting different identities against each other, and then also in specific relationship to the kind of Hindu ethno-nationalist fascism that's going on there. So it was all informed by that moment. And I was looking to this relationship that I found with a distant relative named Prabhakar Sansgary. I had a relative, one of my father's brothers was also named Prabhakar Sansgary, and I was kind of like, oh, I wonder if this is the same one. It wasn't, but it was interesting because this Prabhakar Sansgary comes from Goa, comes from our family, so he is a distant relative, but you know, many relatives exist. So it's interesting. I was looking at, he was a writer, he was an activist, he also was a prisoner's rights activist. He was imprisoned during, you know, the emergency of Indira Gandhi. So he has this long, like, kind of leftist legacy that's going on there. So the film is an attempt to kind of channel some of that spirit, that some of like that like, not just leftist, because we can't just really say leftist, even though he was a part of, you know, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, but it's really just this kind of solidarity with deoccupation, decoloniality, you know, and this kind of workers' rights too. So a lot of different kind of, you know, in thinking of my own political trajectory, just a real sense of camaraderie in time, a sense of like companionship that I was searching for in thinking of like ancestral memory and kind of family mythology and lineage.
I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you sort of explored these ideas in the form itself. You're working with many different types of images in the film, archival footage, drone shots, these Skype interviews that you capture with 16 millimeter film. So yeah, I'm wondering how you sort of arrived at working with this multitude of formats, since you are spanning different time periods and different temporalities, and I'm wondering if that just sort of emerged for you naturally, or yeah.
Yeah, I think it's coming from a place of just it's coming from a lot of different places. It's primarily coming from a place of being overwhelmed, right? There's a sense of like being overwhelmed by imagery, and specifically, you know, I've kind of always worked through the medium of the desktop, even though I don't consider it like desktop cinema or whatever that is. But it uses this kind of way in which we all communicate, and so a lot of my questions kind of focus on like, how is it now that like under these circumstances of borderlessness, you know, this borderlessness that we all exist in, and this kind of like intercontinental, intertemporal communication that we all exist in right now, how is it that like ethno-nationalism and tribalism still has such a fierce stronghold on our imaginations? So yeah, this kind of sense of thinking through time and a sense of building a kind of camaraderie, companionship, through thinking of those who have resisted, those who have said no, those who have refused. And I take centrally the figure of B.R. Ambedkar, who my relative Prabhakar Sansgary wrote biographies on. And so the mixture of materials, from the screenshots to all these things, is a way of like questioning the way in which we receive information, and the way in which that information can then have its own life, have its own kind of, as Simon and Jennie were talking about, this kind of like animism, right? Like giving life to something, you know, the poesis of a moving image, giving it a second life, breathing life back into it.
Shobhan, I'll turn to trust study number one, although I feel like I have to tiptoe around this film a little bit more than the others. Could you start by telling us how you encountered this system of Hawala, and also what about it made you interested in exploring it through film?
Yeah, I guess, can you hear me okay? Using
Yep.
these new Bluetooth headphones, okay. I mean, it's a pretty common system in a way. I think like what sort of attracted me to kind of thinking about it more specifically was maybe like the idea that it was so common in the 80s and 70s, and I guess even into the 90s, but really there was like this moment when it kind of, what it was changed in the West in a way, and in, I mean, India and Pakistan and other parts of the world where it's used. And so I don't want to say like I have a personal relationship, but I think like a lot of people in sort of these diasporic communities from South Asia do to some extent. It's used by so many migrant laborers. It's used, I mean, in any sort of like war-torn, like after the invasion of Afghanistan, it sort of kind of gained another sort of resurgence. It's used, I mean, it's hugely used by the Somali community in the United States. And I think like kind of seeing the way that it was like so important for a specific group of people, but like when the way it's like rhetoricized in the media and everything made it seem like this very insidious, like duplicitous, like dehumanized sort of form that, yeah, I guess that's maybe what attracted me to like kind of thinking about the actual people and bodies that were involved in it.
So the way you end up sort of describing this system and the reasons behind it, the way you use images in relation to the conversation does create this interesting like, cognitive game that sort of unfolds over the course of the film as we kind of gradually sort of piece together a clearer picture of the system itself, and also what these sort of visuals we're looking at means in this broader system. So I'm curious how you ultimately arrived at the visual scheme for the film, using the visual guide as the key sort of focal point that we're looking at, but I am also wondering what made you ultimately to decide to make this a silent film?
Well, I guess, so it started very much as just sort of like a documentary project. In a way, like I was thinking of this in a very sort of traditional documentary way. And then as I sort of started digging in, like that idea that like the word hawala often gets translated as trust, and at least in the United States, it seemed like it was tied to a very specific, like the investigations by the FBI into hawala kind of disseminated the word trust as the main translation. I mean, it certainly can be, but that idea that like trust was this core way of describing it by the people that were trying to sort of prevent it from being used sort of kind of, I don't know, made me like focus on that idea of like why, like what were these layers of trust that were, or what was sort of being seen as requiring trust rather than things that I maybe would have taken for granted otherwise. And so I think that like, I think I forgot the first part of your question, but the second part in terms of like the making it, I guess, and oh yeah, the images as well. Like all these things, I guess, the images were directly from this conversation that I was having, and there's still these very specific documentary elements that were kind of left behind. But that a lot of the decisions that were made were sort of about what this person that I had discussed this with felt comfortable me including. So, I mean, it's kind of laid bare a little bit in the discussion that was kind of left in the film, but a lot of the just like incidental things, like what about this code could be actually revealed, what names would be allowed, what locations would be allowed, were kind of dependent on what he actually thought was the sort of safest way to do things. And so I think that like indexing of our specific relationship kind of, yeah, added this other layer that, yeah.
So, I mean, based on the title of the film, is this something that you're going to make part of a longer project, that the system of hawala?
Yeah, it actually, I mean, so far it's been, this work also has a different sort of cut that's like more of an installation that has sort of sculptures that are also from people that are a part or still sort of trade in hawala in the United States, but are various kind of either security mechanisms that they might use at the place where they actually conduct this business, or yeah, just various like maybe tools or objects. I'm almost like reproducing these things. And so the idea is that like all of these things have, like those objects as well as this film, are things that are kind of described to me, and I don't necessarily get the sort of like, I'm never witness to the objects themselves. So I sort of am thinking about like this project Trust Studies as sort of being all of these sort of different instances, my sort of layering on this trust between myself and these people that I'm interviewing.
Ricardo, to piggyback on an earlier question I asked Shobin, you know, your film takes a very particular approach to framing your subject and the way you're closely describing the photographs in your film. By you avoid reference to dates and names and locations. So I'm curious what prompted you to take this kind of indirect approach to relaying this history of South Tyrol?
Yeah. Hi, Tyler. Hi, everyone. Yes, basically, I was asked. This film come from a commission. So basically, I was asked for an exhibition in Austria to work on the border between Italy and Austria, and I'm Italian. And this territory, South Tyrol, was the embodiment of why sometimes borders just don't work, and it, of course, created a lot of problems in the last 100 years. And basically, that South Tyrol is a region that was German speaking, because it used to be part of Tyrol. So basically, it was part of the Austrian Empire, and then it was annexed to Italy after the First World War, and it remained German speaking mainly. And despite a very aggressive policy of Italianization carried out by the fascist regime in Italy. And then this very strange thing happened, which Italian people are not really familiar with, which is called the option agreement. And so basically in 1939, 20 years after South Tyrol was annexed to Italy, Hitler and Mussolini decided to reach an agreement on the assimilation of the German-speaking population of the province. And so basically the people who lived there had to choose either to remain in South Tyrol and become somehow Italian, so abandon their language and traditions, or moving to the Third Reich territories, meaning losing their landscapes, their homes, and their country, basically, where they lived. So this sort of agreement is called the option agreement, and of course it created a lot of resentment in the local population. Myself, as an Italian, I entered that territory in order to somehow study it as a foreigner, let's say, even if I came from one of the two sides of them, from the Italian side. And looking at archive images from many different places and archives and political movements, I was really fascinated by how the let's say the signs, the iconography of the right-wing movements were totally separated. So basically South Tyrol, it's, if you want, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's an interesting case study because it's a region where there are two totally separated right-wing movements. So there's a sort of an Italian right-wing movement called that's more related to fascism, so to historical fascism, and that is like that territory is part of Italy. While the other right-wing movement is more, if you want, historically connected to Nazism, and it calls for an annexation, a re-annexation to the German-speaking world, let's say. So still there are two very, very separated right-wing movements there that use two very similar iconographies, but not the very same one. So in order to, when I presented those different images in the film, I really wanted to mix those things together and not give any specific elements as to how to read them, basically. And so the voiceover, which is second-person voiceover, so basically it's like a hypnosis session, is just describing what happens in the image with some exceptions. And there's no references to dates or places or names, as if we are facing those different images of violence sometimes of political manifestations, and sometimes of acts of terrorism, or let's say aftermath of acts of tension between different communities. But there's no key somehow to read
these
them.
photos. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly. You found these photos through various archives?
Various archives, yes. Some of them, they are from the beginning of the 20th century, and some of them are from the 90s, I think. Yes, the most recent are from the 1990s.
You're touching at it towards the end of your answer, just this strange atmosphere that you generate as you describe it, a kind of hypnosis session. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about how you kind of arrived at that particular tone for the film?
Yes, the film is based on very long research, but I didn't really want to present a documentary like with a sort of neutral voiceover that knows things, that knows the truth, meaning like in a third-person way. Neither did I want to present this voiceover as a diary, because it's not my diary, and I didn't want to present one specific perspective. So to me, the idea of a voiceover in second person, somehow involving the viewer, was aimed to imagine yourself in an image. So to project yourself in a specific image without having the key to read it, without having the different references to read it, and just try to inhabit that image. And of course, this voiceover is also playing on a fiction, because it's not really possible to inhabit those images without the specific background. So there's like a sort of displacement that this voiceover in second person is aiming at. let's say it's sort of a hypnosis session without you really being able to fall into that hypnosis. Yes.
Well, I think we might have to end it there. I was told these should only be a half an hour, so I think we went over a little. But thank you everyone for taking the time and speaking with us about your films, and thank you for your films.
Thank you so much, Tyler.
Thank you very much.